I'm Devin Zeidelman, Director of Scientific Real Estate Advisory Services at Scheer Partners, and today we're here at the LaunchPort. Located in the heart of the Baltimore Peninsula and one of the premier MedTech accelerators along the East Coast, we're about to go meet with the founder and managing partner, Bob Storey. So Bob, welcome to BioBlast Podcast. We're so delighted to have you here today.
Well, thanks, Devin. It's great to spend some time talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're here with Bob Storey, the founder and managing partner of LaunchPort in Baltimore.
Right. It's good to, beautiful facility here that Scheer has done so much to make it a welcoming place.
Yeah, and obviously you've grown organically. You've had a lot of folks coming here, relocating, starting in Baltimore, coming back. And so we're really excited to dig into everything LaunchPort has to offer. But before we do that, really curious, you are an entrepreneur, I would say a serial entrepreneur. And so we'd love to hear more just about your journey coming out of Arkansas and everything that took you to this point.
Yeah, hardcore Razorback, even after being here for 30 years. But it's interesting, that journey had a lot of influence on how I think about developing businesses and how opportunities present themselves. So I started as a chemical engineer and a chemist. That was my training, my classical training. And began with my first 15 years with Exxon Corporation, not in the oil side, not on the energy side, don't know anything about that, but in the performance materials. And so this was in the 80s when we were creating new engineering plastics. We were changing the automotive industry, for example, new materials to replace steel and metal in cars. And I got involved in business development. I got involved in mergers and acquisitions. We were buying companies. Got involved in forming joint ventures with car companies that were coming to the United States from overseas. So kind of cut my teeth in that sort of business development space, did some sales and marketing. And about 30 years ago, a company in Maryland who was also in engineering product space wanted to sell. They wanted to find a buyer for their company. And I was living in Houston at the time with a young family, and we made the difficult choice to leave cowboy country. My wife is a big Cowboys fan. That was a hard one to come up to Redskins and Eagles and Giants country. But we moved up here to Annapolis I helped this company put together a team, and we sold it to Clariant Corporation, which is the big Swiss chemical company, spinoff of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. And that was my first taste of going into a private company and finding a way to sell it and move it forward. And from that point forward, because we were in these materials areas that overlapped into medical sciences and medical devices, I got very interested in the startup space and in the venture space. At the same time, got more connected with Johns Hopkins, maybe 20 years ago, started to get involved with a lot of their programs. And I've spent time as a CEO of startup, taking it from grassroots to full commercialization. It's a public company now. Worked with a lot of the local entrepreneurs who we all kind of grew up together during the past 25 years. And so as I moved into this sort of startup realm and looking at venture opportunities, really fell in love with all the technologies, the pipeline that's coming out of this region. And that's some of the foundation and the groundwork that led to what became the LaunchPort concept.
That's some great background, and obviously you're located in Baltimore with LaunchPort. You serve on the advisory board for the Maryland Life Sciences, the vice president of that organization. And so, for LaunchPort, for those that are less familiar, can you describe what you do here within the notion that you're a MedTech accelerator supporting transitional manufacturing, and just a little bit more about the type of companies that you're working with?
Yeah, so it was interesting that about 5-6 years ago, I guess it was, I was approached, and I work closely with some partners that were in the medical device space. We were approached by Able Foundation, by Commerce, by TEDCO, some of the local investors in the area that said, we have this problem that we have all these technologies that are coming out of a great incubation environment. And you probably know we have fantastic incubators here. Fast Forward at Hopkins, the Biopark, University of Maryland, incubators throughout Montgomery County, all over the state. Sure. And the concern was that in the MedTech space, in the medical device space specifically, there wasn't really support for those companies after they came out of incubation to actually get to commercialization. They said, we need something that is going to solve that problem, help them stabilize, help give them some support. So we didn't want to do a traditional incubator. We didn't want to do the same sort of venture funding that was available on the seed level. And we tried to decide what was really needed. And we believed that a combination site that had early stage transitional manufacturing as an anchor tenancy, approved by the FDA, registered with them, certified by the notified bodies. But around that site, we would create a venture center where companies who had graduated from incubation and were now trying to figure out how to prove their deployment model could locate here. They could make this their headquarters. And the problems they were trying to solve had a lot to do with the next stage of engineering, the next stage of supply chain. How do I actually make something that is compliant, that'll get through the FDA, that'll get through clinical trials? And without having to hire all that expertise themselves, can they be somewhere that they could, by organic association, figure out how to do a lot of those things? So we decided to create LaunchPort as an experiment, essentially, at the start. Our funds, it's a for-profit model, that would have this electromechanical contract manufacturing capability and a place where people could set up their applications development, their engineering centers that would get them to the next stage. And it turned into sort of a pilot plant for good manufacturing practices in medical devices. We didn't know where it was going to go, but we got a lot of demand. So there's now about 20 companies that are either located here at City Garage, with this as their headquarters, within the LaunchPort umbrella, or they're manufacturing with us. And there are at least 3 companies who had left to make their manufacturing in California, for example, who are now manufacturing. We brought it back to Baltimore.
Right.
And so now these companies have a platform where they can be efficient in their capital spend in terms of getting to demonstrating their value proposition, demonstrating their revenue model, which is important to investors. It's important to strategics who want to see that people have developed some capability outside of the incubation space. And that's turned out to be very successful, a lot of demand for that sort of capability, and very unique, I should say.
Yeah, it's very...
Not a model that you see very frequently.
Yeah, it's very unique. And you all have been very intentional on how you're curating the space and providing sort of graduation or step up facilities for a lot of the great talent and technologies coming out of Hopkins, University of Maryland, as you mentioned,
Right.
elsewhere. I mean, Baltimore is obviously an emerging hub. We'll talk about the tech hubs and the biomanufacturing component of that. But everything from specialized equipment to modular clean rooms. And we took a bit of a tour earlier, and you guys have been really intentional about how the space is allocated, the functionality of it. And so can you just give us an idea of how that came about and how you sort of went through the process of planning out the space and the functionalities as well?
Yeah, so great questions. And it goes back to a little bit, a few years ago, there was a planning process with the Life Science Advisory Board about what do we do in the state to develop our capabilities in life sciences. And a very familiar name to many people, Marco Ciccone, who was the founder of Paragon here in Maryland, was on the Life Science Board, and he was looking at manufacturing capabilities. And he said, I know the biomanufacturing, but MedTech manufacturing, I'm not really familiar with that space. And he contacted me, he said, would you join the Life Science Advisory Board and take on that piece of it? It's really focusing on the MedTech side. What was interesting at that time, 5-6 years ago, was that the state had this huge focus on everything that's needed for bio. Wet labs, we still talk about wet lab capacity. We still need more wet lab capacity. The sort of skills that you need, the scientists, the technicians for working in the labs. But there wasn't a lot of discussion about what was necessary for the medical device and the MedTech space, which is about making things. So to answer your question, some of the capabilities that you need for that is a clean room versus a wet lab. A clean room, which is ensuring that don't have particulates that get into the space, as opposed to making sure you don't get bacteria and viruses getting out of the space like you would have in a wet lab. And that's important to MedTech, That's important to whether you're doing tissue engineering or you're getting ready to package something and get it sterilized. So we decided we were going to focus on that. We would put in clean rooms. We weren't going to touch wet labs. We weren't going to compete with people that were putting in wet labs. Different focus. So that was one issue. So, it's interesting. We have a company in here to kind of identify what this sort of uniqueness of this combination might be, and it's called novel micro devices, and they are next-gen molecular diagnostics, PCR equipment. It was born out of the COVID, the pandemic, and the need for new diagnostics technologies, and they have a base device, which is the analyzer and the PCR itself. But they have to develop the assays, looking at different types of pathogens that they might be testing for. And so in a place like this, they have the capability to do the engineering work, making the physical product that is going to be the analyzer, and they have wet labs that is available within City Garage to do the assay work. And they're all in the same place. They can do both of them. They have their engineers working on the device, they have their scientists working on the assays. And that's a combined capability that's really unique about this site, and that's what we offer for people, particularly in the diagnostic space. We have other folks that are doing 3D printing, additive manufacturing for medical devices, and we can do that within our GMP, our medical device spaces, to make to use manufacturing 4.0, next generation types of manufacturing systems for personalized medicine. The ability to do specialized implants, to generate components that allow revascularization. So we've got a company in here called LifeSprout, Hopkins spinout, involved in really cool technology, the dermal fillers for reconstruction, cancer, post-cancer treatment. And they're spinning special polymer materials in our clean rooms and then formulating those for their clinical trials that allow them to address a lot of different indications. So we've got people in here that are from orthopedics to cardiopulmonary to hemodialysis, an international firm out of Korea doing fantastic things in home dialysis, ophthalmology, neurology, neurosurgery, just about every area that's in this MedTech vertical. They're located here, and obviously a great ecosystem because they're all kind of talking about what's unique to their areas and what's common to the challenges they have.
Yeah, no, it's great points. And so when you think about MedTech, right, or let's take a step back. When you think about life sciences, it's really a large umbrella.
Yeah.
Anything that has a biological component, anything that really has a healthcare type of component as well. And so MedTech specifically is something that you've been highly expert in and proficient in building that ecosystem out here in Baltimore. And so, there's certainly a clean manufacturing component, but even before that, a lot of companies are developing it out of academia, whether it be Hopkins or, it might be spinning out of additional other companies that have been founded and want to, take an idea further. And so can you just break down that sector a little bit more for us and for folks that are listening, just in terms of MedTech and when you think about just the pathways to commercialization, the strategics for making those large purchases, whether they be hospital facilities or clinical institutions, tell us more about just sort of the dynamics of the space.
Yeah, so as you said, it's a big tent and a lot of big ideas there. And I think it's important to recognize how much effort has gone in to this whole activity around this area. When you look to the universities, for example, the transitions that Hopkins and the University of Maryland have made in the past decade, I would say, in terms of a focus on innovation, that researchers can focus on translation of their technology, not just doing basic research. Right. Really remarkable what the institutions, you're probably familiar with Tech Ventures at Hopkins, Christy Weiskel's effort to really transform that. Great thing, Jim Hughes, Phil Robolato over at University of Maryland. Those activities sort of at the start of the funnel started to push out technologies that were translatable, and they thought about how they were going to arrange the resources at that earliest translational research phase to get them ready. Right, that was really important. Second piece was that Commerce, particularly the life sciences group at Commerce, really got behind promoting more and investigating more about MedTech. going to AdvaMed and sponsoring, Maryland activities there to link into the strategics, sponsoring more of the MedTech innovation participation in the state and bringing teams in. Really important. Commerce got behind that. TEDCO got behind that and sort of pushing those things. So that created a fertile ground for things like this, like LaunchPort, and then trying to grow these companies. So what you find in Maryland now is extraordinary expertise in neuroscience, neurosurgery, neurology, which overlaps into ophthalmology. It overlaps into substance abuse management. Huge capability, huge pipeline of capabilities there. Cardiovascular, cardiosurgery. University of Maryland is very, very big in that space. Really strong in the orthopedic space. Mercy Hospital is sort of famous for their very, very cutting edge, high tech sort of support of the orthopedic space. Those are all in the Baltimore area. It's coming out of the medical schools. And so there was this really great pipeline of technologies in those areas that are kind of our hallmark, and as well as clinical consumption and clinical use of those technologies. So that's important, that when you're here and you're developing what this translational plan is going to be, you have to have access to the practical clinicians, not only the research clinicians, but then the ones that are going to deploy the technology. And that's also a great opportunity here. You have both of those pieces. And I think that's what's really been crucial to this ecosystem really becoming robust. A lot of support at the institutional level, a lot of support at the state level, and then the infrastructure for the commercial activities gets put in place. Your final comment, your question was about the strategics.
Yeah.
So we know the strategics really well through a number of different pathways. I was talking to the medical director of J&J a few weeks ago. We were both on a panel up at Hopkins judging some of the biomedical engineering technologies coming through. And it was interesting that he was talking about how they really want to see that these technologies and these companies get the first step sort of validation.
Sure.
They prove a little bit about the value proposition. The strategics just don't walk in, at least in the MedTech space, don't just walk in and license something and walk away with it. They want to see some proofs developed. And they're expecting that the ecosystem is helping do that. And the companies have a few scars, they kind of learn a little bit first, and that's what gets interesting to the strategics. So we see that involvement from the strategics that integrates well with these models to get people matured, efficient, understand the value proposition deployment pathway. And, for lack of a better word, there's sort of a little more adult supervision to get them to that point, that then the strategics are more readily getting engaged in those opportunities.
Yeah, and the adult supervision comment, I think, is attuned to the fact that, at LaunchPort in particular, you're very hands-on.
Right.
You are mentoring, you are providing support for capital raising and pitch practicing and go-to-market strategies as companies get through the clinical process, which is, faster than small molecules or cell and gene therapies. Maybe it's 8 or 9 years for those. These have a little bit shorter of a horizon to that pathway, just given some of the approvals that are needed through FDA. And frankly, I think understanding devices at times a bit more than some of these novel technologies that are being developed in the lab.
Yeah, it's interesting in our space. By the way, the adult supervision comment was something I heard from Kip Cyranakis, who is managing partner at Epiderics Capital. They have a U.S. and a UK fund, and it was years ago, and she was talking about what they need as investors. Yeah. And she used that term, we want to see that when a researcher is coming out, they're brilliant, but they have adult supervision to define what that pathway might be. I always thought that was a great observation. And the reality is that they are the experts. We've got the best experts in the world here. There is no question. The Boston and the Bay Area guys, they will acknowledge that we have this unbelievable clinical pipeline here. But what we have traditionally lacked in the region was this secondary support, the commercial pathways to get them to the maturity that then the acquirers really step in. And we've had some fantastic successes in the bio space. You know those stories. Really some great exits there. MedTech space has not been as prolific in that space. So providing that help is not that we are more expert than the people who are bringing the technologies in. They are the experts in their space. But it's a common theme that a strategic wants to, whether you're planning to sell it tomorrow or 5 years from now, or you want to go public and then hope that somebody, you get it from the public market, whatever it might be. At the end of the day, there's still, all investors want to know that you've got an understanding of what the pathway is to get to that exit, whether you're going to be the one doing it or not. Nobody wants to put their money in stage one if you don't have any idea about what happens stage 2 to 3. And so I think that's part of helping the teams articulate a little bit more about this is what actually has to happen commercially. We may not be the ones that do that, but we get it, and we're putting in place the foundation that it can happen for whoever else does come in terms of additional investment or acquisition. And we talk adult supervision. It's making sure that the important things get validated early in the process, that there's confidence to continue to follow them through.
Yeah, and so you think about the proliferation of some of these early stage startup incubation models, venture creative models. You're a little bit, I would argue, of a hybrid in a sense. And so just tell me about the process and how you approach that when you're helping companies. What are they looking for specifically within MedTech that might be different than someone that's developing a biological therapy or other types of modalities?
Yeah, so I think I would refer everybody to look at a really pivotal paper that AdvaMed, which was is the advocacy group for the medical device industry, wrote a white paper a number of years ago called An Industry at Risk. And what they discussed in there is that in the therapeutic space, in the pharma space, the process of going through the various clinical stages, 1 through 3, and getting to an approval with the FDA is a tortuous path. But if you get there, the revenue models are, I don't want to say they're well-defined, but the payout is pretty clear. Now, the chance that you're going to stumble and not be able to convert the animal model to the human model, or you'll have problems in the safety studies, I mean, that's legendary. The hundreds of millions of dollars that go in that are lost because they don't make it all the way. If you do make it all the way, then there's some confidence about what the payout's going to be. That's sort of the nature of that business. So in this paper that AdvaMed was discussing is that investors will put their money in and they will tolerate clinical and technical risk because they know if they make it. They may lose it all there, but if they make it, they kind of have a feeling what that return will be. In the medical device space, you can get an FDA approval and never succeed.
Right.
It's all about the revenue model. And how do you define what that revenue and that adoption model will be, and how successfully can you credibly define that at the beginning, even before you've even made a product? So our space in MedTech is all about really digging into the validation model. What would you actually have to do to prove the value proposition to who your economic buyer is going to be, even before you've gotten the product approved? And getting people thinking about that and the proofs they need to establish is what an investor wants to see, because in our space, you can eliminate all the technical risks and get an FDA approval, and your product is a garden ornament, because that you haven't really figured out how that's actually going to get reimbursed or how it's going to generate a return on investment, whoever the economic buyer is. That's kind of the fundamental difference between our two spaces. And so it comes back to this issue. What would be the things I actually have to do to get to that product? It's the difference between invention and innovation, the difference between technology and product. That's what we focus on in our discussion with folks. People that come here generally are looking to get tapped into that network. We are very networked in this MedTech space. I'm very involved with everything in NIH in terms of the neuro and the diagnostic space. We do a lot of programs, a lot of innovation programs with them. And I think most of the companies here are trying to figure out that navigation. How do they raise their probability of success? There's no silver bullet. We all know that in the startup space. But that's what we're trying to improve the probability that they can succeed as they come through this process.
Yeah, and so then how early would you recommend founders to engage a group like LaunchPort, like yourself, or to be thinking about the business plan? Because obviously, as you think about it, it's a sales process, it's a marketing process, it's an educational process. It's, trying to understand what the market share is from the incumbents and what that moat around those opportunities are. Because if you think about med devices, I think you made the comment at maybe an event in the past, but thinking about just sort of the knee replacement and how it's gone from very barbaric type of surgery to something that's much more refined and more common now. And then you think about like neuro implants and stage 1 versus where we might be in 20 years. And so, talk to me about that process. Talk to me about how early you want to engage and then what you're telling companies.
So there's something we teach a lot in our innovation programs. You probably heard of I-Corps. So I teach the Hopkins course in that short course and do it on a national basis with NIH. And one of the things we talk about is the difference between a business plan and a business model. And an early stage person should be thinking about the business model. You think of a business plan as all the details about, who do I need my sales force and what's my organizational chart going to look like and what the MBAs do, then you got to do it at some point, right? Business model is kind of the core metrics that really matter about the development adoption of the product. And that is the piece that people need to be focused on very early in the process. What really is the beachhead's indication that I'm going to pursue? People like to talk holistically about things, but where do I really have the most perfect fit of any choice in the world for my product versus that particular market segment? So you should be thinking early about where is that fit? Where is my core competence, very objectively, honestly, right? And thinking about how people make adoption decisions. Why does an economic buyer at the clinic or at the hospital actually adopt a new technology? Understanding how that happens, not just from a clinical or technical point of view, but from a business point of view. It's always about the money. And I'm not talking profit, we're talking about allocation of resources, right? It's always about the money. So at the earliest possible stage, you should be thinking about the business model. Now, what's really fortunate for companies here in Maryland is that the Maryland Innovation Initiative out of TEDCO, which started in 2012, late 2012, basically put together the application that is forcing the applicants to think about those critical adoption metrics. It's actually not that heavily weighted on the technology. It's about what does it look like as a product and what are actually the commercialization steps. Not, I got to build a factory, I got to hire a sales force, but what would I have to demonstrate that someone would see as important? So people have access to that in the state, that kind of model. They have what's being taught at Hopkins and University of Maryland and Morgan State, for example, and their research groups and their engineering groups are thinking about that. What is the model piece to be successful? I would recommend that starts before you start to build your product, because how you build your product, and think about MedTech, there's data integration, right? Do you have to download updates? Do you have to replace parts? Does it need service? If you implant it in someone, do I have to be able to take it out if it fails? All those things, you should actually be able to think about and investigate before you put a screwdriver to a screw, so to speak.
Sure.
So that's one thing we tell people heavily. The other thing from the financing side is you never want to go out and raise money when you need it. You want to be, and what I mean by that, you want to be understanding who the players are in that field, what their motivations are. You don't want to be pitching to them before you understand your business model. But you certainly want to be talking to them. You want to be going to those conferences. You want to be going to BHI's, crab trap competitions and seeing who is there and what they're interested in, because the investment community is just as diverse as the delivery community you're going to. They have different priorities, and trying to understand who those folks are, making those personal connections long before you're ever asking for money, I would recommend to any kind of innovator. They're getting that familiarity. So when does come a time and you've figured out that business model and you're starting to raise money, you're picking up the call and saying, Sue, I have something you might want to look at, right? So those sort of activities can never come too early in terms of familiarizing with your space, who the stakeholders are in that space, and how stakeholders are making their decision, whether it's a clinical stakeholder, an administrative stakeholder, an investor stakeholder, a strategic stakeholder. You should be familiarizing your space from the start.
Yeah, I think what you're insinuating as well is just there's so many levels to commercializing a device.
Yes.
There's so many stakeholders and levels of engagement. So if you're, a world-class engineer and you have a world-class idea, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, commercialized and generating your revenue, and you're going to get rich, not quick necessarily, but get rich in a variety of facets, both from a economics perspective, but then also supporting, patient outcomes, supporting health disparities, things of that nature. And so, when you look at the industry of MedTech in particular, over the last couple decades, 5 years, where we are today, and ultimately where we're going, can you just give us your take on sort of that evolution and progression, and just share some maybe of the challenges, how you solve for that puzzle?
Yeah. So also a great question, a big question. The thing about MedTech versus biotech, sort of the tension that exists between those oftentimes has to do in therapeutics versus sort of mechanical addressing a problem. You see it in orthopedics, you see it in cardiovascular. Which is going to win, regenerative medicine or mechanical repair, for example? You saw that in metabolic areas, right? With Ozempic and the diabetes drugs. As soon as that came out, the folks that were making glucose monitors, their stock price dropped immediately because that's going to wipe out diabetes. It's going to be a medical solution. So those are sort of normal tensions in that space about which is are people going to prefer a systemic approach to correcting disease conditions, or are they going to take a med tech approach to that? So that's one active area of debate. I think what's really intriguing for med tech in general, though, is this issue about biological and digital integration. That's why the neurosciences, I think, are so exciting and frightening at the same time. Right? So I had an opportunity years ago to be in a small group listening to Ray Kurzweil, who is the guy who wrote The Singularity is Near, which is he's when artificial intelligence is going to be equivalent to human intelligence, which he says is going to be about 2040. It's probably going to be earlier than that. That's what we're seeing now. But what was fascinating about that discussion, this was in the 2000s, I think, when I was in this thing, and he was projecting what was going to happen with smartphones. We didn't know he was talking about smartphones. He was talking about personal computing and needs that drive innovation, right? And he started talking about the healthcare space, and this was at the point when deep brain stimulation was just starting for Parkinson's patients. There may have been a couple dozen people who had deep brain stimulators, and they're managing their tremors. And he had been going out and interviewing those folks and talking to them. Do you feel like there's anything alien in your body? And no, I don't really sense anything. I'm just functioning differently. And so he was, even years ago, he was projecting this is where in the neurosciences space, regardless of the stops and starts in terms of social concerns and pushback and bioethics and that sort of thing, he said this is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of digital human interfaces, direct management of prosthetics, embedded monitoring of our physical condition, miniaturization of how we deal with pathogens in our system, that sort of thing. He said that's just going to happen. And I think that's the med tech space that is evolving. And it's, there's a lot of opportunity there. It's sort of uncertain what that landscape will look like, in a few years. But I think that's one of the big trends that's occurring in that space. So you see this regenerative versus mechanical, tension. You see digital integration into a lot of the devices, digital neuro integration. And I think in general, when you also hear a lot about sort of cyber integration into medical devices. For years we've talked about you have all the ventilators being operated off a central system in a NICU, and someone goes in and hacks into Nashville Baptist NICU and shuts down all the ventilators and all the kids, right? So this move ensuring that devices are being managed properly with the onset of just integration of Internet of Things all over the world is also an important part of our space that we see as a continuing trend for the next however long you can think about it.
That's very insightful. And when you think about as well, just the convergence between MedTech, generally sort of under the umbrella or arc of life sciences, But data, cyber, security, I mean, there's so many things that are now kind of coming to the surface that maybe a couple of years ago you weren't thinking about.
Yeah.
And so are you providing companies guidance on how to address those? Or is it just something that you have to react to in real time and try to understand as it becomes, part of the new norm?
Well, so one of the things that we try to do is make sure that we stay pretty well embedded with who are the thought leaders in that space. So in some cases, it may be someone who's working in that space and we'll say, you probably need to go spend some time with this person or this company to get a better insight. Because as I said, others are the experts, right, in this. So that I think that's important, particularly in the data side. So, what I find interesting is that there are a lot of commodity devices from a pure engineering and device point of view, but the getting access to, maybe it's a user interface, maybe it's access to a particular user community that is generating these large databases that are important. One of the ones that, sort of famous a few years ago, Flatiron, had developed basically what electronic medical records technology for oncology. Roche bought them, and for $2 billion, I think it was, and everybody was going, why would Roche buy an EMR company? It's kind of ridiculous. Well, they had 40,000 oncologists. Right. And so there's this massive database of information, patients, and diagnostics in their space of interest for their developing. And even when that happened, there were some head scratchers. A couple of weeks ago, I ran into a young man that was working for Flatiron now in the data side. And he said, with the advent of, think about where AI has come since that acquisition occurred, now all of a sudden, they're able to mine this data with new AI tools that weren't as sophisticated back when that acquisition was made. So all of a sudden now this ability to mine these big data sets is creating new insights in terms of therapeutics development or particular population healthcare management, that sort of thing. So that's a fast moving area too. And sometimes I'll see a technology and I'll say, that is so mundane. It's such a commodity. And you have to step back and say, but do they have some special access to data that might make that piece might be unique? So that's another dynamic that is very interesting. Fortunately, this area, we have a lot of very competent data analytics, computational science, whether that's coming out of NSA or APL or Hopkins or UMBC is very good in that space. University of Maryland Systems has a lot of capabilities there too. So we're kind of rich in terms of resources, in terms of core capabilities to exploit that. Focusing all that to turn it into something monetizable is the trick. Right?
Yeah. I think people always, nowadays at least, talk about how AI is going to replace jobs or AI is going to be the workforce of the future. And you talk about MedTech 4.0, the integrations of big data. But really, I think at the end of the day, you still need someone, to use your earlier point, tightening the screw, right?
Oh, yeah.
Someone being physically present, at the, not maybe it is the bench, to make sure that, regardless of the data sets or the efficiencies or productivity gains that are netted from those efforts, that there's a level of consciousness and ethics around how they're using it and how they're leveraging those tools.
Yeah. So I think we talked earlier about we also have this. A number of us around town are really focused on this idea of making things. Yeah. Baltimore DNA is a manufacturing city. Shipbuilding, steel, automotive was here too. There's a Ford plant that's long gone. But this was a place. This is one of the old cities that made things. Now the new technologies, the new manufacturing, medical devices, manufacturing 4.0, additive manufacturing, is this next generation, and there's still this DNA in the city that we're really trying to reinforce and exploit in terms of making things, because you still do have physical products that interface. And we've talked about this transitional manufacturing, that the first stage of it, demonstrating that and being competitive when the volumes are modest at the start, before you can really get into heavy automation, is we view as a critical capability that we have to support. We have to make that competitive too. Otherwise, it leads to the offshoring that we saw with the chips, in the chips area. And so the EDA GBC, Tech Hub designation. We have very strong focus on biomanufacturing, manufacturing supply chain, an element of that. How do you ensure that we're building that capability as well, as all of these tools are necessary to support this expansion in healthcare? And you probably saw, Wes Moore made the comment, a month or so ago about what about the folks in Cherry Hill, where the average household income is $35,000. Well, that's, you can say, I want to create a bunch of PhDs in all of our great universities, but that middle class of manufacturing, which is sort of atrophied a bit, is where we can really focus. The things we're doing in terms of transitional manufacturing is giving people with a GED or a high school degree to actually get really good paying jobs, and clean manufacturing is one of the things we think is something that Maryland can do, that we can do in Baltimore as well. And so it goes hand in hand with all these other elements that we're trying to develop in terms of an ecosystem, but we're very strongly focused on ensuring that that part of the industry doesn't get forgotten, because it's crucial to developing and delivering all these devices. And we think we can do it here.
Yeah, you almost think about it in the sense of like blue collar, blue coat, or like blue collar, white coat, right? Yeah. And so Baltimore has emerged as, a biomanufacturing hub with a lot of promise. Obviously, LaunchPort decided to locate here. You have a lot invested in, I would say, the state of Maryland, the Department of Commerce, the state, Maryland Tech Council. And so there's a big push, obviously, to devote resources, both in terms of human capital, incentives, and financial support to growing this as a tech hub for biomanufacturing, to a certain extent, precision medicine. And so, a lot of in that is positioning Baltimore and thinking about the strengths of it, which are very well documented. I'm curious to get your take on some of the challenges we still face as a city and maybe even a state.
Yeah, so there are, so the strengths, obviously, as you pointed out, the pipeline of technology, high tech is really very strong. There's an interesting component with us being close to the Department of Defense and the sort of the defense activities that occur, because a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of initiatives at the federal level to ensure supply chain security, sort of modular manufacturing in a lot of different areas, not just, making things specifically for the DoD, but there's a lot of secondary concerns there in terms of our biomanufacturing, our materials, componentry. That's sort of a lot of discussion have been about that. But DoD is very active in that and funding that. So we have a lot of relationships there. Those all create strength for Baltimore specifically. The challenge is, part of it is ensuring that we've got the economic activity to consume all of the workforce development. And I think there does need to be some kudos that go to folks like Maryland Tech Council, what Kelly has been doing over there, and there's a lot of broad workforce development activities. GBC has been very focused on that. But you can create a talented workforce, and if you haven't created the economic underpinnings for that, then you've created workforce for Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Delaware, right? So if you're trying to do something where provincially, in the greater metro area, you're creating that capabilities, you still have to get to economic development. And there's the balance in Maryland, when you compare to some other states, is that it's very highly focused on sort of the institutional strategic, strategies at the universities, at the government level. This is a federally backed state, for a large part. And we probably have less participation on the commercial side. You go to a lot of the events in the Bay Area or Boston, and it's the big commercial activities that are really involved in the strategic discussions. So we have to elevate that more. We need to get more engagement. We have some engagement, but I think we need to have more. We have to have more outreach for that. The other issue, which we do compete against, is tax structure here is more difficult when you're trying to build businesses. So you have to be selective about how you support industry and which sectors can manage that burden. So those are some of the structural challenges we have. But the cost thing is interesting. It's not as straightforward. I pay this much in taxes, or I have this sort of permitting burden. I had a real interesting conversation years ago with the engineering VPs at company called Respironics. Some people may know it. They were one of the prominent manufacturers of CPAP equipment, bought by Philips a number of years ago. They're in Pittsburgh. They built all of their devices in Pittsburgh. Their competitor was building them overseas. And they said the proximity, the ability of our people to just get on the floor, respond quickly to changes and customer demand far outweighed what the spreadsheet said were the savings by sending this somewhere else.
Right.
And they had 50% of the market, billions of dollars of market, very successful, kind of a leader, I think, really in that space. And so that was also important. You got to look at some of what might be considered intangible benefits of being close to where this innovation occurs. And that's what we have to use to offset what some people may think are structural difficulties for the state in terms of tax and that sort of thing. So I think if we focus on those abilities and we're very objective about how we put those to work, we're already seeing that we're able to be competitive in a lot of these areas, and so that's what we need to continue to work on. And we hope that this sort of pilot plant concept that we have is serving as a model. I just had visitors today from South Korean investor who, just before this interview actually, who said, "This is interesting. He says we have a saying in Korea that the beginning is the halfway point." And he said, "This is really, we don't have anything like this. We ought to have partnerships to connect between the two regions for this kind of model, this sort of demonstration model to help mature technologies." So we think that's the future for us.
Yeah, and you've developed a lot of perspective during your time here in Maryland and elsewhere, and in particular, you were just recognized and sort of selected to the Maryland Business Hall of Fame. And so tell us more just about where you stand in the ecosystem. What do you want to be a part of going forward, and how do you see your role playing out?
So that was a fun event because there were some friends there that also were in that Hall of Fame. Bill Nyland, Ken Malone were a couple of guys that I've worked with a lot of years that were in that. When they read the bio, it kind of felt like they're reading the eulogy. They're going to say, "We're going to miss Bob," But I think part of the joy of this is that there is a core of folks that are really excited and motivated to try and accomplish these kind of goals. I think I kind of referred to some of the activities that I've been through in the past. I looked back at my career after a lot of years, say, so what was it that it kind of appealed to me all along the way? We all do things well. We all have failings, things that are strong, things that were weak. And it was years later and fairly recently that I sort of looked at when I was at Exxon, when I was, this engineering company that became Clariant's division, and then the startups and everything. I was always involved in puzzle making. And it didn't realize it at the time, but I would get involved in something. There's a lot of sort of miscellaneous pieces, and how do you pull those together to create something that's of value? And I realized that no matter what organization I was in, I just kind of gravitated to that sort of thing. And I guess that's what I really love, and that's why this was exciting, because it was a puzzle. What do you put something together? But what we're doing in the state and the city is a lot of that too. We have a lot of very clear strengths, but we have a lot of little pieces that how do you put them into an aggregate that is powerful and is meaningful, something that can scale? And that's where the real enjoyment comes from. If it's not on the enjoyment list, I'm at this point in my career that the things that are fun and the things that aren't fun I get rid of, and all these things that I'm involved in are a lot of fun.
Well, it's apparent you've been a champion for the MedTech space particularly, but really broadly the state of Maryland and Baltimore, and a lot of that has to do with the scientific community. And so a lot of the pieces of the puzzle is really brought together by folks that have invested in community building in the ecosystem. For example, your neighbor here at City Garage's BioBuzz.
Right,
and so you've been instrumental and really a champion of building out the community, both from perspective of the larger sciences, but specifically within the notion of MedTech and devices. And so what does it mean to be part of this community, to be a leader of this community for you?
Well, So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many people that are making this community what it is, right? That's what's fun about it. I think the BioBuzz thing is really interesting. What Chris has been doing and focusing on is this idea of community, and he sort of stretches from, the sort of the DC metro area over to Philadelphia, and where are the linkages there? Where are the areas of collaboration? And he has been communicating community and how do you pull those different skills together, which I think has been really great. I mean, we have, media does a pretty good job in general, but he focused very specifically on that community building, which I think is also a unique approach, and tried to make sure that there was more communication between these areas that sometimes can get very siloed. Right. I think that's another thing that you see that in any sort of dynamic development community, is people can kind of get into their silos, and there's so much happening in their area, they don't know what's happening next door. So, and you even saw that, you had BHI, and you had the Maryland Tech Council, and then you had the universities that had their programs, and they're all doing fantastic things. And what I've seen over the past few years is this real effort to cross-communicate and see which, each of those organizations, what is your core competence. You see Upsurge, right? With what Corey and Maddie are doing over there, which is looking at the horizontal sort of capability. How do we engage the full population in terms of innovation? So you're starting to get crossover between those things. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit. And that's where leadership springs from, right? People start to see that there's an opportunity. What I would like to see, this is one of the elements of the EDC program, is one of the parts of the manufacturing core that we put together is the plan to stand up a community manufacturing center out of Coppin State, which is looking at how do communities view the engagement of manufacturing into their community. There's a lot of trust in urban and rural communities with manufacturing. And that's another level of engagement that's different from all the others, right? How do you ensure that policy is actually getting over to the manufacturers and the businesses like us when we're spinning things out? The facilities are being stood up in communities where wealth is being built in the community, right? There's always great big highlights when something, there's a buyout, there's an exit, and there's billions of dollars. And sometimes that doesn't mean anything to someone on Main Street. And so that's one of the things. I'm very excited about that. What Ron Williams is going to direct that if this funding comes through from EDA, but it's going to be focused on how do you ensure that the communities have a voice and are collaborative with manufacturers in terms of restoring that manufacturing back into our communities. And the reason I thought of that in this discussion is that's a leadership thing too, because we have a generation of folks that really don't have any context about manufacturing and what that means. What would be great is in these communities, people get interested. Well, I want to be in that supply chain. I actually could do a machine shop. I actually could do something in terms of electronics fabrication that would be useful in that space. And that's a pathway for me as well. And we want new leaders to come up out of that ecosystem. And I think that's what this crossover and the cross communication really does, is it's allowing the creation of what that next generation of leadership is going to be.
Yeah, it's very well said. Very well said. And when you think about the ecosystem too, and the community piece of it, you're only as good as the sum of, you're only as good as the sum of the parts, right? And so that's access to talent, it's access to capital, technology and IP, and then it's obviously the facilities piece. And so LaunchPort has done a fantastic job of trying to solve for all of that within the MedTech space. You're continuing to grow and expand. You have some incredible companies here located within the Baltimore Peninsula. And so, here at Scheer, we're obviously very excited to follow your growth and to be connected with you, Bob, and just appreciate you all for joining us today here.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you. And, I think the transition here is when Scheer did take over the site, really understood that there's a bigger community opportunity here. I think I've told you how unique this site is. I talked to other people around the country. There's not really anything quite like this that we have here, which is fantastic. But our aspirations, we're 25,000 square feet here. I'm always kind of, pinging the Scheer guys about, we might need another chunk over here because where we see things are going to be happening. But we also recognize that these, not everybody's successful out of the startup environment, but our goal is that the people come out of this, they go into their own facilities in the area at some point. And that's when startups go from being a burden to a community to being a contributor to the community. And I think we got the groundwork here for doing that successfully. And we really appreciate the support from Scheer because they've been a great partner in this throughout.
Yeah, I think we're just getting started here. And when you think about City Garage 2, you have those natural collisions taking place. And I think that's the incredible piece to be part of, even just coming here and working here. You have pretty easy access in and out. You have a fitness center, you have conference space, shared amenity space, and so. We're
sharing people too. That's a thing that has really been exciting to me in terms of ecosystem development. There's some great articles on what makes an innovation hub, and people look at that on a global basis. It's things like, if you create it here, you consume it here too. Those are elements, that are necessary. But one of them is the fluidity of human resources. Yeah. And we're starting to see that. I'll pick up a phone and need a resource, and I'll talk to one of my peers and say, do you have anybody that is a little slow right now, but you don't want to lose? And it's amazing. I've got a project that hasn't come through yet. This young lady, she's great. Don't want to lose her, but I don't have a lot for her to do. I'll pay her salary. Send her over, and we'll take. We start to see that. The startups in here, have a change. They'll be on sales and marketing, they'll be on clinical, they'll have somebody, they say, we'll shift them over to another company. And it's not stealing, it's not poaching. And it's people having sort of that fluidity to move between where the opportunities are. And that's efficiency. That's when, people are able to get a jump start on doing things by using the resources that are being developed in the area. And that's really exciting. We actually starting to get across that threshold. And that to me is an indicator that's just another piece of the foundation in this innovation ecosystem we need to have. There's a lot of different building blocks in this thing, as you know, but that's one that's been exciting because I think that's legitimate and that's starting to increase.
Yeah, another piece of the puzzle. Bob Storey, founder and co-managing partner of LaunchPort. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks, Evan.
All right, thanks.